I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome back to the podcast. I hope you had a lovely festive break and all the very best to you for the new year. I'm very excited for the start of 2020, new year, new decade. It feels like we have a big challenge ahead to put a lot of things right, but I also feel there is a lot to be positive about, and I hope you do too. This first episode of 2020 was recorded in early December, but it is sadly more relevant than ever right now, as we watch the effects of global climate events and, in particular, the wildfires that are destroying many areas, none more so than those taking place in Australia. I know some of you are listening in Australia, and if you're affected by the fires, then I wish you all the best. And I think it's safe to say that anyone watching the coverage of the fires is saddened deeply by the devastation and damage caused to human and animal lives and to the landscape as a whole. My guest for this episode is Saul Elbein. Saul is a freelance journalist who writes non-fiction features for outlets such as the New York Times magazine, the National Geographic, and one that some listeners may be fans of, the radio programme and podcast This American Life. He writes terrific pieces about the environment and the complex and often tense relationship between people and the land. The National Geographic published an article by Saul on December the 9th titled How to Live with Megafires, Portugal's Feral Forests May Hold the Secret, which provides an insight into what conditions are needed for megafires to occur, the effects they have on humans once they take hold, and how we can, and indeed must, be responsible for curtailing these events in the future. However, the way forward is not certain and will undoubtedly involve a large amount of individual responsibility. I began by asking Saul just how much of a problem forest fires are becoming across the globe.
Forest fires are getting more numerous, they're happening in more countries, and they're getting much more dynamic. And I think a good case study is what happened in Portugal in my article, which was that you had the combination of a forest that was way more stocked with fuel, in this case, the sort of detritus of the eucalyptus and pine that have been going wild all over that country as the lands have been abandoned, and a really unstable atmosphere that was just charged with energy, both from climate change and also from this kind of air conditioner effect of all of the ice melting in Greenland, which has made kind of a, I don't know if you have this in Britain, but we call them swamp coolers in the U.S., the kind of window box air conditioners that just pushed this level of stable, cold air against this unstable, hot air that was coming off of Europe. And Portugal, that pushed this mass of cold air over the forests of Portugal. So what happened in Portugal, which is pretty similar to what's happened in California, Australia, Chile, Greece, Catalonia, and that's starting to happen in Central Europe, was that a forest fire started that usually when these sorts of fires happen, they bank really big during the day and they get smaller at night as the humidity rolls in and as the temperature goes down. What happened in this specific case, which is really scary, is that when the humidity rolled in from the sea, it kind of evaporated off the front of this fire, which is way bigger than has generally been seen even in the big wildland fires in Europe and California. And it sent this plume of steam up into the atmosphere, almost to the border of space. And because of that mass of cold air, that reaction was contained. When you contain a heat reaction, it makes it much more powerful, like the difference between a blast furnace and a fireplace. And so what all that meant was that it suddenly flash burned this very large area that a lot of people were trying to escape through. And in Portugal, killed about 70 people. In Greece, I think it was closer to 100. In California, it was closer to 100. But in all of these places, the same sort of thing is happening, which is that fires are getting bigger, which makes them more difficult to model, which makes them more difficult to predict, which makes them more difficult to prepare for and escape from.
So you mentioned, obviously, California, Australia, places like that. What areas are most at risk? Is it those? And in fact, are there more areas becoming at risk year by year?
Yeah, so Marc Castelnau, who is the chief of fire science for the autonomous region of Catalonia in Spain, who basically is the person they turn to before There are thousands of firefighters going into the field to see what's going to happen. He described fire as sort of being the marker of ecosystems that are on the move. His theory was that ecosystems are shifting north. The boreal is moving north into the tundra. The more temperate forests are moving north into the boreal. The plains are expanding. And what happens as these ecosystems move at the fringes of them is fire. And a big part of his case that he's making to people like the European Commission, to the government of California, is that that change can't be resisted really so much as it has to just be lived with. So what all of that is a sort of long way of saying is that right now the most dynamic fires are in what we call Mediterranean landscapes. You get big fires in interior forests in the boreal, the interior forest along the Rockies. But for the really, really bad ones, you need to have that dynamic of a really hot land, which is overgrown with trees, next to a kind of cold ocean. So that's why you see really bad ones in California, Greece, Australia. It's along a sort of sun-baked coastal strip next to a cold ocean. So you're getting them everywhere, but you're particularly getting them in these kind of sun-baked coastal strips that are next to cold oceans that are full of trees, where the land has been abandoned by smallholders and trees have moved into populated areas, or, as in California, where people have moved into these traditional fire lanes where fires have been moving forever. The one other thing I'd add is that because ecosystems are changing, that fire zone is growing. So when Mark Castelnau went to Chile for the first real big outbreak of these new kind of wildfires, he came back and he told the European Commission, it's going to be probably within 5 years we're going to see these in Europe. 5 months later, there were 2 huge wildfire outbreaks in Portugal. So now he's saying probably within 5 years we're going to start seeing the little forest fires that have been breaking out in Central Europe turning into something bigger and scarier, and that's something we need to prepare for.
In the UK, we are told that reforestation is the way forward in terms of the climate. And actually, these fires are happening in places that are very densely wooded. But it's not as straightforward as that, is it? There's a reason why they're more susceptible to wildfires in terms of the wood that's actually present. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
I think the thing that people need to kind of subconsciously do every time they hear about a tree planting program is they need to be a little bit more savvy, and they need to say, okay, what kind of trees? How are they being planted? Where are they being planted? And why are they being planted? Because you addressed a couple of related but distinct issues. One of them are tree planting programs, which in industrial forestry is just generally how you bring back the next harvest. And in places like the U.S., Finland, Germany, where industrial forestry is really highly developed, it's almost treated like a crop. So a fire in a young, managed pine plantation is just going to burn through everything if the fire is hot enough and the pines are small enough that their crowns can easily be reached by the fire. And that's a problem with tree planting, and that's a distinction between a tree farm and what we would actually think of as a forest. So that's one problem. I mean, the other problem is that forests in general, be they natural or artificial, are often really, really stocked with fuel. In the United States, that's been because we've had 50 years of a very stringent fire suppression regime, which has stopped the small fires that help prevent big fires. There's been a correction underway now for about a decade, which is sort of slowly filtering out to the various hinterlands. But that dynamic of unmanaged, uncontrolled landscapes that lead to unmanageable and uncontrollable fires is the thing that I think we need to be concerned about, which is why in my story, a lot of the Portuguese and Spanish fire chiefs were saying what we need is not just better ad hoc fire suppression, we need to actually have more people out in the landscape caring for it in various ways. And there's various things that they've suggested. One was a more year-round approach to fire suppression, in which even not during the fire season, firefighters and volunteers are out preparing the land for the inevitable fire. But the big thing that they suggested is more or less a return to the forests. That the one thing that keeps forests well managed is if they're being utilized in a small scale and sustainable way by people who live off of them. So in the Mediterranean, this looks like small scale animal husbandry in the forest. It looks like having some olive groves breaking up these masses of trees. It means maybe some small scale biomass harvesting. But what all of that does is, first off, it puts eyes on the ground. And second off, it helps to break up what are now these huge feral forests that are spreading in the absence of any real control and that are a real fire risk.
And are they a fire risk because of the species that are present or popping up?
It's a bunch of different things. So there are some species like eucalyptus, which is from Australia but has been brought all over, and pine, which is from all around the Atlantic but again has been brought all over. Both of those species like to spread by fire. They are adapted to it. In the case of eucalyptus, a eucalyptus tree can burn to the ground and it will send up a green shoot within a few weeks after the fire, which is a really good strategy for colonizing new territory full of trees that aren't as resilient to fire. There are some species of pines whose cones only open in fire. So to some extent, this isn't even really a problem. It's just ecosystems adapted to fire are ecosystems adapted to fire. And if you know that and you can live with that, then that's not really an issue. Where it gets to be a problem is where people don't know that and aren't used to living with it. But we have to distinguish, too, between fires that are happening in places where they're fire forests, as I like to think of them sometimes, forests that are adapted to fire, and then the fires that are happening in places that kind of aren't, which are at the fringes of these moving ecosystems.
Well, actually, as you were talking, I thought it was interesting because in your article you interview Philippa Rodriguez, and she mentions that she's actually thinking about moving away from her rural home and moving closer to the city because of safety issues. So is the Portuguese government asking people to move into areas to manage them where actually other people are moving out because they're concerned about their well-being?
You know, with Philippa, it's a really complex thing that you actually see all over rural areas, all over the developed world, which is that it's hard to make a living in the rural, which is part of the reason why people are leaving, which is part of the reason why forests are coming back, which is part of the reason why fires are getting worse, which is part of the reason why people are leaving. You can't really, I think, decouple those things from each other, though. I mean, if Philippa's friends were all still there and she had a good job that she didn't have to drive a long way for, then she probably could more easily weather the fire risk. And that doesn't mean the fire risk would be any better. It just means that there's this sort of larger decomposition that's happening in rural areas around the world, and fire is one marker of that. But I think it should be seen as like the nexus of a bunch of different complex factors. Mm-hmm. As far as what the Portuguese government is asking people to do, the Portuguese government isn't per se asking or incentivizing people to move out into the rural. But one reason why that is, and one real stumbling block in land management in a lot of places like Portugal, where settlement is very old and families have been there for a really long time, is that the land is so fragmented in terms of owners and is so, I don't know how better to say it than off the books. The land rolls are really, really old. They're really, really inaccurate. They'll say things like, this is John's property, which is bordered by Rodrigo's property, which is bordered by Elena's property, which is bordered by a river, which is bordered by a road. And that roll was entered 70 years ago. All those people are dead. It's not clear which road that is, and the river's dried up. I mean, that's a little bit of an extreme example, but that's basically the problem that people are dealing with in Portugal and to some extent in Spain and Greece. And in order to have any kind of national land policy, you need to have a map. Right across from Felipe Rodriguez's house, there's a big parcel of eucalyptus. It's not legally allowed to be there. One of the fire prevention measures that the Portuguese government put in was that none of these fire-loving trees within 100 meters of a settlement. No eucalyptus, no pine. Well, I saw pine and eucalyptus around pretty much every settlement I went to, much closer than that. And in Felipe Rodriguez's case, she walks out every day and sees it 15 feet from her front door, and nobody knows who it belongs to. It's not legal, shouldn't be there, but nobody knows whose it is. There's nobody for the government to go knock on their door and say, hey, tear this down before you get fined. And so that is the first step for the Portuguese, just figuring out who owns what so that they can even begin to address the problem.
Yeah, that is a huge problem, obviously. And the other thing that I thought might be a problem is the knowledge still there to manage the lands, or is that kind of dying out as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really big problem, too. I mean, there was a kind of a great cultural dying, like a cultural extinction event almost, in the 1940s and 50s all over the world as people left the land. And one reason for that, which is totally understandable, is, you know, when you can go to the store and get fertilizer, you don't bother with mixing cow shit with pine needles. Like, you know, when you can go to the store and get turpentine, like, you know, to use as a solvent, it's not really worth the trouble to harvest it from pine trees. And there are all these examples like this. I mean, the big thing that happened was the Green Revolution made agriculture way more productive because it infused, you know, the stored wealth of millions of years of energy in the form of fossil fuels. And there was no real way and no real need for rural farmers to compete, so they left the land. And so a lot of those folkways are in some sense coming back, and some have never left. Like, one thing that the firefighters in Iberia, in Portugal, and Catalonia pointed to was just having some farms, like olive groves, cherry orchards, that break up these otherwise unbroken masses of trees will break up the fires. It's much easier to stop a fire that's moving across this kind of checkerboard of forest and field than it is to stop a fire that's like a wave in this undifferentiated ocean. That's not hugely complex. The other thing is, like, a lot of people are trying to bring back, or are in fact bringing back, more traditional animal husbandry, which was done in forests. Like in the highlands above Barcelona, people are trying to bring back this mixture of modern and traditional shepherding, which uses traditional means and traditional methods. And I can't say too much about this. It's a story I'd love to do, but I haven't done it yet. But in combination with, you know, new marketing and new awareness of markets to make that something that's a little bit more economically sustainable. So I think there is the chance for it to come back. And I think the fact that there is such a service digital economy where people can work for anywhere could mean that there could be people moving back to some of these smaller towns, as is in fact happening in Portugal. The concern there that the Portuguese fire chief raised was that people who just move back in and aren't actually in some way engaged in the land, even if they're doing it part-time when they're, you know, working at their tech job, are just going to be more potential casualties if a really big fire breaks out. Like, there'll just be more people in the way.
Portuguese government aren't incentivizing people to go back to the land. They're not pushing people into it. And actually, in your article, you did quote someone, and they said that actually this isn't really a government instructive. This is something that needs to be done from the level of the people. They actually need to take the reins back and do something, you know, interact with the environment in a completely proactive way. And I thought that was really interesting. Do you think that there is actually the onus as much on the individual? Do you think we have been sitting back and waiting for the powers that be to take a lead on this when actually it's not happening?
I think the real trouble that we're facing is that most people are not in a position to put hands-on solutions into practice because so many of us are generations off the land. Like in my case, my probably great-great-grandparents might have been farmers in Eastern Europe. My grandfather ran a dairy, but probably lived in a town, and everyone since then has lived in big cities. So, I mean, I didn't start to learn a lot of rural concepts until I learned them in Spanish, like rural and land management concepts, geographical features. Maybe I'll be able to think of an example while we're talking about this. But the point was, not until I went to places like Latin America, where there's still a pretty vibrant and frankly prosperous in places peasantry, did I start to learn a working jargon for how forest and agricultural lands work. And I bring that up to say I spent the first 15 years of my life living in what I now know is the world's largest tree farm, or one of them, in the American Southeast. I mean, I just didn't even see it. And so I think it's hard for people to put firsthand solutions into practice in any of this when they live in cities. As far as whether we've waited for other people to fix it for us, though, I think that's a pretty apt statement of the larger crisis. I think there is very little practical leadership. I think all solutions that are offered are solutions of consumption or solutions of basically identity. I think there's been a ton of time wasted arguing about these sort of tribal politics around climate change, which haven't really done a whole hell of a lot of good. And I do think that there has been a lack of bubbling up from the grassroots that I would like to see. I don't know quite how that would happen, but I would want to see something much more like, people out in the wildlands innovating and focusing on what they themselves can do versus this focus on, arguing about national politics, which ultimately have relatively little impact in the lives of most of us. Let me just add one caveat to that too. Like, it's really easy to just, to sort of like launch a Jeremiad against other people and the way that they live their lives and the way that we live our lives. And I want to be clear, it is a we. The sort of sclerosis at the top, if you want to call it the top, and the sense of unease and malaise at the bottom are kind of the same thing. And I don't want to call other people out because I think this is something that, I'm implicated in as well. Like, I think it's very hard to look at the big thing, but I think we still have to.
So is it lethargy or just lack of knowing where to start? Or do you think a lot of people don't actually understand the scale of the problem still?
I think it's all of those things. I think it's mostly that people don't understand. I mean, I think, and it's also who are people. Like, I think one thing that we're kind of talking around here is that wildland management has been really professionalized over the last 100 years, which is great in a lot of ways. There's a lot more science than there used to be. But also there's a sort of practical hands-on knowledge that has been lost, and where it's been kept in the service of these basically industrial forest products. The people who have what Nassim Taleb calls skin in the game, the people who actually are living and dying based on the decisions that they make in terms of management, are either wildlands firefighters in the terms of literal living and dying, and more figuratively and more pervasively, the managers of industrial forest plantations. Like, there's not too many smallholders anymore whose, in the aggregate of their decisions, can help create something new. And I want to be clear, we shouldn't idealize the era of smallholders. I mean, there is forest in central Iberia, in the Iberian Peninsula, for the first time now in thousands of years. I mean, it was basically all gone when people had to live off the forest. And one of the kind of dirty ironies of forestry in Europe is that probably all of the forest would have been lost if the steam engine hadn't been invented and we hadn't switched to coal. I mean, that had a lot of really ugly downstream effects. It had a lot of, really, I don't know if we'll say positive, but definitely powerful effects. But it definitely also saved the trees that were otherwise going to be used as fuel. So, I mean, I don't think that we should, idealize the pre-industrial world exactly. But I do think there's a lot that we can learn from it. And I think the more firsthand knowledge that people are able to get about how these systems work, the more they'll be able to, do an accurate seat of the pants, gut bullshit check about things that they're being told. And I think one place where I see this a lot now is, by now pretty much anyone who's hip to these issues is aware that trees are made of carbon, and they're aware that as trees grow, they pull carbon from the atmosphere. And probably they can go the next step and say, if trees burn, they release that carbon back into the atmosphere. The thing is, one of the really popular offset programs that's used, that will just get, marketed to you kind of all over, is tree planting as a carbon offset. So, as I said earlier, I think when people hear tree planting, it's very easy to hear, oh, trees are good because, we live in cities. Trees are good, because there aren't very many of them. And the ones that we see are pretty well managed by, again, professional groundskeepers. As I said before, I think one thing that helps, and that will help, I think, spark the curiosity that helps people learn, and I'm speaking from personal experience here, is to start asking questions like, you hear tree planting program, your gut feeling maybe is more trees, great. But go a step further and say, where are the trees going to be? What kind of trees are they? For example, are they trees that, suck up more water than that place maybe has to offer, like eucalyptus trees? Are they being planted? Or is a forest that's already there being sort of encouraged to expand beyond its borders, as most forests will, if given the opportunity? How are they being cared for? Are they being cared for? I think these sorts of questions start to move us past the kind of knee-jerk environmentalism versus development notion that a lot of us who grew up after the 70s got in school, which I think is a simplified model. I have a forthcoming series in National Geographic on these forestry issues that really delves into some of the complications of our modern system of forestry and where it's going. I think one thing that I'd like to leave people with is just an image, which helps, I think, to contextualize this stuff. And that image is, I'm going to take you to someplace other than Portugal. I'm going to take you to Estonia for a second. And in Estonia, there's this very, very old forest religion that probably precedes the invasion by the Teutonic Knights in the 13th century. To this day, people will still go out to the woods to get married, to gather water from sacred springs, sometimes even to give birth. And in southern Estonia, there's this notion called the cross tree, in which people traditionally, when somebody died, would go out and bury them, and then halfway back home to their house would stop at a likely tree and carve a cross into it, which would be seen as the resting place for their spirit. Now, I bring that up because I think it's a really good metaphor for kind of what we're dealing with here. In a place like Estonia, and a place like North Carolina, and a place like Spain, a lot of these forests that are burning and that are growing and expanding are forests that have replaced fields. I like the metaphor of the cross tree because it really, I think, hammers home this idea that to some extent forests and human civilization are in an uneasy equilibrium or an uneasy balance. When fields expand and towns expand, forests shrink back. When forests expand into towns, the towns shrink back. And I think all over the world, we're seeing fires in these forests that have expanded over old human settlements. You can go to Spain and Portugal and see photos of the aftermath of wildfires, and you'll note that under the burnt out trees, there's terracing, which shows that the land was improved to support a population and then abandoned. And in the south of the U.S., we have a specific kind of forest called old field pine, which is the specific sort of forest that grows wild over old cotton and other crop fields. And I think what I like about all of these analogies, all of these images, is that they all in different ways point to a relationship between people and forests, and between particularly settled civilization and forests, that is really complex and beautiful, a little bit scary. The connection between, the life of humans and the death of trees, and the life of trees and the death of humans, is, I think, something of the kind of a holy terror that this topic ought to provoke in people, which I think, frankly, makes it a lot more interesting. I mean, I think if I were, going to suggest one thing, it would be more awareness of the kind of flesh and blood reality that all of this moves around, rather than the kind of bloodlessness that comes with, buy some carbon offsets to pay for your plane ticket. I mean, so much of this is mediated for so many of us through these very, very abstracted means. And I think one thing that really helps, and that has really helped me, is to kind of begin to fall in love with that more wild and terrible quality that comes accompanied by the wildfires, but that also comes with a world that is changing in ways that are, I think, impossible to predict, and that really can only be experienced.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's beautiful. Thank you. It's like a kind of combat stroke dance routine when humans rub up against nature, but it's who knows where it's going. Would you like people to go to your website?
Yeah, they can find my work at www.saulelbein.com, and they should know that I'm, this is my area. I've been writing about this in various ways for 10 years. I can find a lot of other stories around forestry and the human relationship with forests on my website, and they'll be able to see a lot more in the coming months.
And if you'd like to visit Saul's website, it's saulelbein.com, Elbein spelled Elbein, and of course there will be links to his website and work in the show notes. Thank you to Saul for sharing your knowledge on this relevant and frankly terrifying topic, and thanks to you for listening. I know the break was short, but it's good to be back, and I have lots of brilliant content already lined up, so please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and you won't miss out on any of it. Catch you next Tuesday. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps, and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.